Okay, I think we're going to get rolling. So, good evening to all of you. I'm David Rubin, the Brown Foundation Curator of Contemporary Art here at SAMA. And tonight we are going to have what promises to be a lively discussion with some of the artists in our water flow exhibition. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that there is a beautiful catalog for the exhibition available for purchase in our museum store. I hope you'll consider owning one. Also, before we start, please remember to turn off your cell phones. The format tonight will be as follows. I will be inviting each artist up in alphabetical order. And of course, as you can see, tonight we have Justin Boyd, Ansen Seale, Liz Ward, and Liliana Wilson. All of their work is on view in the exhibition. Each artist will come up and spend about 10 minutes in dialogue with me going through some images of their work, which you'll see overhead. And then when we finish that portion, they'll all come up and I'll ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. And rather than introduce them all at the start, we'll introduce each one individually. So to get things rolling, it's my pleasure first to tell you about Justin Boyd. Justin holds a BFA from the University of Texas at San Antonio. He also studied at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and he received his MFA from the California Institute of Arts in California. He has had a number of solo shows and DJ performances. He's both visual artist and sound artist in that sense. And some of the institutions where he has either shown his work or performed include the Art Palace in Austin, the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, Sala Diaz here in San Antonio, the Weissman Art Museum in Minneapolis, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego. Justin's work was also featured in the 2007 Texas Biennial, and currently he is on the faculty at UTSA. So won't you join me in welcoming Justin Boyd. And if we could dim the lights up above. There we go. Okay, Justin, come speak close into the microphone. Yeah, okay. So let's begin then, if you could tell us about this ceramic work, Breaking the Waves, from 1997. Tell us about the impetus, what it is, what it means.
Sure. Ooh, sorry about that. Well, David had asked us to sort of bring in work that was chronological, so I thought, in a way, I'd kind of take things back to where some foundations of, or some earlier threads of work that are kind of still running their way through the work here in the show and even shows after that. So when I first started out, I was studying ceramics, and my emphasis in undergrad was ceramics, but I was always attracted to and really focused on sound and how sound sort of visualized itself early on. That was an early interest, but that process of really sort of investigating sound sculpturally and audibly was something that I was doing with these early ceramic forms. So this was the way it sort of started out, very simply. Like the one on the far end was a sine wave that I had taken and sort of built out, and there was like a square wave, and it was basically like the building blocks of sound synthesis that I was starting to just expand out, and there was a sound, sort of a modified sound of the sine wave in each of that piece. In the square wave, there was a sound of a square wave in there. So each of the 5 pieces held sound within them. And it was sort of, clay was the emphasis because it was just easy for me to build things by hand. So it was really a lot about form, but also sound and how those two things started to work together. But that interest sort of got me started. Those interests had gotten started, let me say, by my interest in DJing and electronic music, and sort of that sort of grew out of high school, and this was how the work was kind of materializing at the end of undergrad. So I went way back for that one. And
this piece has a soundtrack, so if we listen, I think we'll hear it.
So this was an image. The video is still taken from a performance I did at Sala Diaz when I just moved back to San Antonio from Los Angeles about 2005. And what you're hearing is I'd been working on this performance piece that was dealing with American folk records and music, and this performance led to this whole series of sculptures that had come out in the Sala Diaz show. But what you're seeing is like an image in the background of a woman crocheting, and that crocheting was done. The suit that I'm wearing in this piece is actually a hand crocheted suit, and there's 3 records on the turntables there, and each of them have the little pop you're hearing is like a piece of tape or a sticker or I've scratched out the groove on a record. It was this sort of literalization of like DJing, scratching, cutting, these sorts of techniques applied to turntables and records. And so I would start with like 3 or 4 turntables and just slowly build up loops from there, all performed live. So the idea of the crocheting was this sort of like this visual analog of the record as a loop is sort of locked into a groove. It's that sort of same sort of hooking and looping as the crocheting. So I thought it worked well as a visual analog.
Justin, obviously you didn't make the leap directly from sort of DJing in a conventional way to DJing in this very conceptual art format. Could you maybe just say a word or two about how you made that leap?
Sure. I started with the conceptual part and then moved to regular DJing after that, actually, because I was just very interested. It was through hip-hop and just my interest in hip-hop and seeing a lot of turntable performance by very skilled turntablists, as they were called. I was just interested in minimal music, and so when I was starting to work with records, it was like, okay, if I'm gonna, I can't really like scratch. I didn't have the technique, so I just thought I'd just scratch the record or dig it out. And I knew about Christian Marclay's work, but I hadn't really seen some of his like cut records and things like that. So luckily, I didn't have an idea that it had already been done yet. So I was sort of working with these records just as material, and then I started to realize like for me to get better, I needed to learn like the rest of the art of DJing, and because DJing I think is at its core is storytelling, and that's the part. Those are the things that conceptually I was very interested in. It's a sort of, it's a tale, a thread, and I was always interested in. Like this performance was just strictly using American folk records, and the research that went into that eventually led to this whole body of sculptures. So this is actually, if you've seen the show, this is a shot of the performance the night of the opening when this piece had opened, not here, but in Austin. And
You're talking about the piece currently on view in Waterflow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks. So the piece, and we'll show the image next, but if you've seen the piece in Waterflow, like there's a back table where the map is kind of laid out on. That little bench was supposed to be multi-purpose, as was the raft, as was everything, to serve sort of a dual purpose of sculpture, stage, and the raft was built, the bench was built to sort of fit in perfectly and house the turntables. And so you can see there on the records, like you can see these little pieces of like colored tape and things. Those are the loops, and that's how I sort of lock all the grooves together. So but the records and the performance of this night, of the soundtrack to the video, were all given to me by my granddad, and he was a professional fiddler, and so that's all based off these fiddle records that my granddad had given me. And the soundtrack is, yeah, you can go ahead and switch it. The soundtrack is for the film that you see projected on the front part of the raft, which was it was called Meditation on a North Flowing River, and I had gone on this trip up to the headwaters of the Mississippi River and done filming not all the way down, but it went quite a ways down into Illinois, working along the river. And in a way, it's an homage to this Ralph Steiner film from 1929 called H2O. But when Ralph Steiner was definitely, I mean, when you see the video, I mean, if you've seen Ralph Steiner's work or his sort of more avant-garde films, I think you can definitely see the reference there. But then at the same time, the raft is made out of woods that were harvested and majorly commerced along the Mississippi River. There was live topiaries. Unfortunately, we couldn't have live topiaries here, but in the other viewing it was. And so the soundtrack was performed live there. And a lot of times that there's that sort of relationship of where sound may start the idea for what the sculpture is going to be, and sometimes sculpture works towards sound. And there's not always sound with everything, but there does seem to be that element frequently. This was in the same show. This was at the Art House in Austin, and I'm just talking about the tree piece in front, not the sort of domed piece in back. There's two pieces in this image, but this piece was also part of this investigation. That's kind of that turntable performance where you saw me working with the American folk records had sort of started me on this series of shows, about 4 shows dealing with Americana and our history here. And and it sort of manifested itself sometimes in audio pieces strictly, or field recordings, and sometimes as sculptures too. So this one, sometimes both. So this one was taken with field recordings. So the audio that's moving up the piece, it's a tree, and it's called U tree gate coal tape, because there's basically that sort of idea this tree is cracked and kind of fallen over and created this archway, but where the sort of dead growth has created this arch on the right-hand side there, the left side is new growth, and the sound that's feeding that new growth, or the sort of element that's feeding it, is taken from a coal plant. And I'd recorded the sound of coal being that at that moment where coal is being transferred to steam. And quite often, just through compression, geological compression, forests are turned to coal. I really like this idea that then coal is sort of transformed again through steam to power, that sort of life cycle. And this show and the video and the raft piece also deal a lot with this idea of the cyclical nature of things and cycles and transformation and more about transition, actually. So the sound that you hear, and I don't know if there was actually, I may not have put the sound on this one. It was it was really short. But it's basically the sound of the coal was just, I'd shortened the sound and pitched it so that it would make this melody that would go up and then come back down again. It would sort of rise and fall with the tape. And you'll see that also, just seeing the reel-to-reel, I'm sure that most of you have seen those. But I deal a lot with analog technology, turntables and reel-to-reels and projectors and things like this, because there's really not much mediation. With digital, there's a lot of mediation, and the process may be hidden in some sort of way. And here, I think it's pretty direct. You see the piece of tape that's spliced, and you see it go up, and you see it come down. There's no fooling where the loop is. And when you see the turntable performances happen live, there's an acknowledgement of that performance, but also you see that on the records. You see what's happening in front of you. So this. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we have sound with this one.
Yeah, this is what the coal actually sounds more like, is this sort of white hiss, but I had pitched it in the other one. But this was a piece that I'd just done for the Texas Biennial, and it was actually the curator had commissioned me to make a site-specific piece for the Biennial. And so my piece was actually going to be at the Mexican American Cultural Center, and that building was very interesting and based on the pyramidal design at Chichen Itza. And so I'd gone and done some recordings there on site. And what's really interesting about this building and the site is that it's surrounded on either side. It happened to be the first day I was there. There's these giant power lines that move to the back of the space that were, when I was there, it was very humid, and there was a corona effect happening, which is, the corona effect is where the sound is snapping off the power lines. The moisture and the electricity through the lines are creating this snapping, buzzing sound. So I'd recorded that sound. Then on the other side of the museum is Town Lake right there in Austin. So I'd taken the sound of these two currents, so the electrical current and the water current, and had worked them into this sculpture. So what you're hearing here is those sounds processed and worked into a composition that was played out of these two forms. So the image on the left is the forms as you had to, there were basically, at Chichen Itza, there's these sort of serpent heads that come down to the bottom of the pyramids, and these shapes are obviously very modified, but my sort of take on this idea of a serpent head, and these are these sort of sentinels that you had to cross this sound barrier, the sound field, in order to gain entrance into the show. So this was just sort of a site-specific piece. And this is sort of what had happened. The last pieces was not really chronologically, this was different, but I thought I'd just show something more recent. But this was the work that I started working on immediately after the Mississippi River project. And these 4 shows, there's going to be 4 basically, but they're kind of moving from east to west as I'm going along. The Solidillas, the turntable performance, was sort of eastern and more domestic, and then the Mississippi River is certainly more middle of the country. And then I've been working on a project last year along Route 66. And so this is a result of some of my, I'd gotten a travel grant from Art Pace and was working on Route 66 as this sort of the sister road to the Mississippi. I was thinking of the sort of relationship between the Mississippi River and Route 66, about these sort of byways of commerce and travel. So these were just some images that I'd worked on, just some photographic work of these signs that I'd been collaging, and then work started coming out of these sort of images. This is just 2 photographs of collaged images.
In looking at these, I'm reminded of Christian Marclay, who you mentioned earlier, particularly the album cover collages, where he combined similar bits of information. Okay, let's see what's next.
So the work on Route 66 basically led me towards a show. This was in Austin in December. And a lot of this research, and a lot of my work is, I do a lot of research ahead of time and spend a lot of time reading. And this was a culmination of a lot of different influences and things kind of just compounding themselves into a goulash of Route 66 westward expansion. I mean, there's kind of a lot of things and different threads from past shows kind of coming through it. But of course, was rereading like Grapes of Wrath and had been reinvestigating the beats again, and just a lot of sort of psychedelic music reviews, and just it was just a whole wide range of things that was sort of influencing I was writing about and thinking about, and then looking at the signs and listening to music on the road has sort of spawned these works that are these sort of amalgams of part signs, part things I saw along the trip, part things I just sort of imagined or wish I would have saw. So there's this sort of jalopy car with a Cadillac Ranch fin kind of coming off the back, and this Godspeed sort of sail pulling it along in this little trailer that has this really long title on the back of it, which is actually on another piece. But a lot of text really, this whole show is generated out of text, just writings, and those writings were then taken and I was just combining them and cutting them up. A sort of Geis and Burroughs cut-up technique of just allowing chance to collaborate with me and come up with these sort of titles, and then starting to work on the pieces from that sort of randomized chance operation text. So the little thing on the back is like the Moriarty UFO, was taken from the Moriarty UFO. If you've been on Route 66, I'm sure you've seen it. And then some pieces were more just sort of, again, the kind of just collage. This was somewhere in between a flower and a windmill. I mean, it's just called Frames of Wind because this was something I'd seen just on part of my trip. Kind of, it was this beautiful shot of a windmill that was, as you're going towards the painted desert, it was just sort of totally hazed out by the heat and the mirage of distance and heat, and it just sort of had turned to this beautiful kind of flower floating there above. And this was a piece. This was the first piece I'd done in any sort of light, and yeah, it was. That's it. I mean, it's a windmill, flower windmill. Sort of. Yeah. So the really long title, the titles. I mean, there was an interesting sort of back and forth between what was the text on the pieces and then the title for the text too. So this really long title on the left was actually that it was on the little wagon, that the vinyl that was on the little wagon in the couple images before, but. Obviously the one on the right is pretty self-explanatory. This era was ripe for miracles, but these are all these bits and pieces of signs sort of recombined and talking about like, the sort of Dust Bowl, forsaken land, certainly on the piece on the left, like the sort of leaving home and going towards something like an area or an idea of something that might be promised or something that you're really hopeful for, but sometimes those things aren't exactly what you think they are. They may not work out the same sort of way as when you get there, and so there's that sort of tension there in between them.
And we have sound with this one.
And this is the most recent body of work, and I just finished this up, and the show came down. It was at the Test Site Gallery in Austin, and this work is really totally different. And at Test Site, it's an interesting project where they ask an artist to pick a writer to collaborate with. And so I had picked a writer who was on the East Coast, and he and I, it was sort of my dream pick, and he actually said yes. And so we sort of started this collaboration. And the collaboration was kind of like building over 4 or 5 months, 6 months, and then I realized that like it wasn't going to happen the way that I was hoping, and he realized that it wasn't going to happen the way he wanted it to. And so I was sort of left with this collapse of a collaboration, and instead it sort of took a little while to figure out what I wanted to do, but instead of asking one writer, I asked several people, just friends and the community here in San Antonio and in Austin, to let me back up one step, because where the collaboration sort of collapsed was this idea, and he was sort of an older writer, and I was certainly younger. I mean, to say he was a little more bitter about things wouldn't be an overstatement. But we sort of ended this collaboration on this point where we were really having these pretty interesting discussions about like how to continue to make work and as our role as like cultural contributors and these sorts of things. And I was very sort of optimistic and hopeful about things, and he was quite the opposite. I mean, he was full of joy, but very pessimistic about things. And so I had asked people to sort of start writing. I was sort of lost for a bit there and just sort of thought, well, am I doing this alone, or are there other people who are finding themselves in a moment where things might be hopeful, or is there something that they have faith in, or there's something like expressions of love? So I just started asking people to write letters about something they were hopeful for, or someone that they were, or something they were thankful for, or thankful to, or an expression of love of some sort. So they had written letters for me, and when they wrote, I recorded the sound of the letter being written, and then it was also written on a sheet of not copy, but carbon paper. So they got to keep the original, and I asked them to send it or give it to whoever they'd like to. And then I kept the carbon, and I was scanning those in and working with these letters of faith, hope, and love essentially together. So what you're seeing, and then I worked with Hare and Hound Press here in San Antonio to do this series of relief prints. So it's really difficult to see. Those are 3 prints there, but the 3 prints that you see, sort of more detail is the one there on the left with love. So they're relief printed, sort of a blind embossed, so the text is just barely there, and then where the word would come through, it was just a little bit of the ink would come through that plate. And then I'd also, the one in the center, there was just a series of strokes and letters, so I was really just playing with it formally and building sort of organic letter vine out of just individual letters, and then copying them by hand, not just pasting the whole thing, but like, so each of these, there's these sort of idiosyncrasies and things don't fit in exactly the same way, so they sort of move, and there's a little bit of swing to the construction of it. And then the one on the right is, I don't know if you can see anything on it, but it says beginning finally. And again, like, I'm very interested in this, not only with the collaboration with other people, but with chants too. And so there was a lot of words that had been cut up, and I'd sort of narrowed it down and then allowed chance operations to sort of come up with some sentences, and I would sort of edit from there. So beginning finally was one of these that sort of one of the prints. There was quite a few more, but I thought and the sound you heard was actually processed sound of the letters being written. And I collaborated with four other people too, to ask them to remix that sound as well. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Justin.
Sure.
Next, we'll hear from Ansen Seale. Ansen holds BS degrees from Trinity University. He's had many solo shows, including shows at Blue Star Contemporary Arts Center, Solidillas in San Antonio, the San Antonio International Airport, Paisano Gallery in Marfa, Texas, Kettle Art in Dallas, and Three Walls Gallery here in San Antonio. His work was also chosen for the cover of the recently published book, Art at Our Doorstep, San Antonio Writers and Artists. Join me in welcoming Ansen Seale. As you can see, Ansen calls this a slit scan photograph. That's probably a term you're not familiar with for the most part. Ansen is also an inventor of sorts in that he invented a very unique kind of camera. So before we talk about your images, Ansen, I'd like you to tell people a little bit about your camera, physically what it is and how it works.
Okay. A slit scan camera is very similar to a panoramic camera. And panoramic cameras, as everybody in San Antonio knows, have been around for a long, long time. O.E. Goldbeck here in town is famous for his pictures of bathing beauties in Galveston and so forth. You've all seen them. And the camera was also used for years to record the exact moment when a horse would pass the finish line. So your photo finish camera never needed to be synchronized with when you thought the horse was going to pass the finish line. The shutter was continuously open, and the film then was being pulled very rapidly across a slit. And that's where you get the name slit scan. So in a way, these images are a time exposure, if you will. They're a time exposure, but only in one direction. So what I did was, in the process of creating a digital panoramic camera, I realized that the camera could be used, interestingly, in the ways that you're going to see. And so my quest over the past 10 or 12 years has been to explore what it is this camera is actually seeing. So these images are not manipulated in Photoshop. That's probably the first thing you think, well, he's taken Photoshop, taken pictures and stretched them around. No, this is the way that the camera actually views the world. And so I think that, because we view photography as a kind of proxy for reality, I think that there is a reality here, reality which maybe, well, that we're definitely not aware of, but that we can only see through the camera's eye. So I started doing these images at places where I knew that there would be some sort of movement, because something has to move. So you can imagine these people as being the horses in the horse race. And instead of the horses all going in one direction, these people were all sort of moving back and forth in front of me. This was down at a parade in King William District.
And could you just go a little bit further about what the camera's capturing in this particular instance?
Yeah, so the camera is really only seeing one pixel column of an image in three colors, red, green, and blue. So left and right is a time exposure, and so it's building up these columns of pixels to create the picture plane. Normally we have an X and a Y, horizontal and vertical plane of film or digital sensor or whatever that's exposed all at once. Well, that's not the case here. The left and right is a time exposure, and the up and down, each column of pixels, is a snapshot. So the strange thing about the camera is that moving things are clear and still things are blurred. It's just the opposite of what you'd think with a regular camera. So in this case, you can see that the train cars were moving and the clouds at the top were moving a little bit, but everything else was still and was blurred. I took this down at the St. Paul's train station, here downtown here. And you might expect to see all kinds of buildings and so forth, but it looks like West Texas because the camera's only looking at one spot. I'm looking right between the buildings. Parades are an interesting subject with this camera because you have things that are moving at a fairly regular rate and things that are still on the other side.
Ansen, talk a little bit about, like, for example, how you end up with this particular length, this particular width. How does that come to be? How do you decide that? In your medium, it's kind of hard for us to picture that. So
Right.
Try to give us a picture of that.
Okay. Well, since the left and right of the image is time, it represents a certain amount of time. And because this is a digital image, I am